Imagine this. You are hiding on the rocks above Thermopylae as a Persian spy. The year is 410 BC. You are tasked with evaluating the formidable Spartan army that stands in your way. You anticipate seeing giants honing their blades and iron barriers. Rather, you witness naked guys sitting in the dirt, oiling their skin and meticulously combing their long hair. Reporting that the enemy is behaving like women at a spa, you dash back to King Xerxes. Xerxes chuckles. He believes they are crazy. However, an exiled Spartan king who isn't smiling is standing by him. Whispering the horrifying truth, he turns to face the big king. The Spartans don't prepare themselves for conceit. Only when they are certain they are going to die do they fix their hair. What you witnessed was not a recreational pastime, it was a funeral ceremony. Those men don't intend to make it through the week. If you love learning about the hidden facts of history, you might want to hit the like button and subscribe for more stuff like this before delving into these lost tales of misery and survival. Please let me know where you're listening by leaving a comment below. I think it's amazing that people from all over the world are studying these old tales together, bound together by our common interest in the past. In actuality, those 300 soldiers were never intended to be present. It was the time of the Carnea, a sacred celebration at Sparta, during which fighting was strictly prohibited. During the Carnea, marching an army was considered a transgression against the gods and may result in death or banishment. The Spartan government declined to organize. The remainder of Greece was instructed to wait until the full moon. However, King Leonidas was aware that the Persians would not hold out. He was aware that Greece would burn if he obeyed the law. Thus, he discovered a weakness. He may have a personal bodyguard instead of the army. The young top cadets who typically possessed this distinction were rejected by him. Rather, he personally selected 300 senior veterans. There was just one thing he needed for this mission, a fact that indicates this was a suicide run from the beginning. He required each man he selected to have a living son back in Sparta. A tactical unit was not what Leonidas was constructing. He was making sure that these men's families wouldn't perish along with them. Queen Gorgo did not ask him to return safely when he left her. She requested his last directives. Instead of saying, "I love you," he said, "Marry a good man and have good children." He had already left. They marched north to the Hot Gates, a slender passage where the sea meets the mountains. They joined a coalition of roughly 7,000 other Greeks there. When you consider what was about to happen, it seems like a lot. At that time, Xerxes was leading the biggest invasion force in human history. According to current estimates, there were 200,000 soldiers. This was a moving city that sucked rivers dry, not an army. They had crossed the ocean on a boat bridge after marching all the way from Asia. The horizon was now a sea of campfires as they sat camped on the plains of Trachis. Convinced that the Greeks would flee when they saw his numbers, Xerxes waited 4 days. They remained still. He dispatched a messenger to the Spartan line out of frustration. The messenger simply pointed at the enormous Persian army and issued the straightforward order, "Lay down your weapons," without offering any stipulations. In front of his 300 fathers stood Leonidas. He didn't negotiate, he didn't make a speech. "Come and take them," he yelled back, using 2 words that summed up the Spartan spirit, Molon, Labe. You must comprehend just what Leonidas was shouting at in order to comprehend why his disobedience was so startling. In movies, the Persian army is frequently depicted as a chaotic group of slaves under the influence of whips. That is a whole fabrication. The force facing the Spartans was the most advanced military machine the world had ever seen in terms of riches, sophistication, and technology. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Xerxes gathered more than 2 million warriors, and when they paused for lunch, they drank entire rivers dry. The millions figure has been refuted by modern historians, but the truth is nearly as horrifying. The majority of estimates place the number of fighting troops at 200,000, plus a sizable support personnel.
That was a migratory supermetropolis in 480 BC, not an army. It exceeded the combined population of nearly all of the Greek city-states. It took almost magical logistics to move a force this size. 4 years, King Xerxes spent that much time getting ready for this invasion. He changed the Earth's topography to his purposes, rather than merely marching. Xerxes did not take another chance when his fleet encountered a perilous peninsula at Mount Athos, where storms had destroyed a previous Persian navy. He ordered his engineers to excavate a canal right through the ground. They carved out 1.5 miles of shipping lanes through solid rock and sand. The Hellespont, the slender waterway dividing Asia and Europe, Xerxes built 2 pontoon bridges and used papyrus and flax cables as thick as tree trunks to connect about 700 warships. He paved the decks with wood and dirt to prevent the horses from looking down at the river and getting frightened. He actually crossed the seas on foot with his empire. This was Persian logistics. Millions of pounds of grain were stored years in advance at supply depots set up along the Thracian coast. They were an industrial force that could not be stopped. But Xerxes' worst flaw was his enormous bulk. It ticks a clock a force of 200,000 men.
Hundreds of tons of wheat and thousands of gallons of water were used daily at a rate that is difficult to conceive. They couldn't stay on the land for very long. Because his own army would hunger before the Spartans, Xerxes could not just besiege Thermopylae and wait for them to perish. He needed to keep going. He needed to make a breakthrough. This offers a fresh perspective on the Battle of Thermopylae. It was a battle of time as much as a battle of swords. It wasn't necessary for Leonidas to murder everyone. All he had to do was halt time. The Persian beast became more ravenous, thirsty, and frantic for each hour the Spartans controlled the pass. Xerxes was aware of this. He must have had a mixture of anger and fear as he sat on his throne and observed the small group of Greeks obstructing his multinational steamroller. The numbers were in his possession, the engineering was his, and the right to reign was bestowed to him by God. However, he was caught in a congestion. He gave the command to attack. Instead of sending the elite warriors first, he dispatched conscripted soldiers from the empire's periphery, the Medes and the Siconians. Many had short spears and wicker shields, making them weakly armored. Although they were courageous men, they were going to be put into a meat grinder that was made just to kill them. The vast Persian Ocean was going to converge into an area the width of a rural road. It didn't matter how they got there now. The engineering was irrelevant. The money was irrelevant. It was only geometry now. It was no coincidence that Leonidas selected this battlefield. Thermopylae was a masterwork of defensive selection in an era when topography meant destiny. Thermopylae means the hot gates in Greek. The natural sulfur springs that sprang out from the base of the mountains and filled the air with steam and the smell of rotten eggs are the source of the name. It must have appeared and smelled like the entrance to the underworld to the superstitious warriors advancing toward it. However, it was a choke point from a strategic standpoint. The coastline was not the same as it is now in 480 BC. The sea had not yet been forced back by the sediment at that time. The pass was extremely narrow, a strip of land between the Molon Gulf on one side and the steep limestone cliffs of Mount Kallodromus on the other. The passage was only about 50 feet wide at the intermediate gate, where the Greeks restored the ancient Phocian wall. The most significant character in this tale is this 50 feet of soil. It is the reason the fight took place at all. This is referred to as a force multiplier in military theory. The fact that Xerxes had 200,000 men was irrelevant. He had archers, chariots, and cavalry, but it made no difference. An enormous force is immobilized in such a small area. The Greeks could not be flanked by the Persians. They were unable to encircle them. They were unable to overwhelm the line with their superior numbers. They had to direct their enormous army of warriors into a narrow stream as they advanced in a column. This indicated that the odds were not 200,000 against 7,000 at the point of contact. 100 Persians and 100 Greeks faced off.
and Leonidas liked his chances in a man-to-man fair battle. This leads us to the men who are positioned behind that wall. We have to give credit where credit is due, even though the mythology centers on the 300 Spartans. Leonidas was leading a coalition. There were about 7,000 additional Greeks standing shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans. Men from Tegea, Mantinea, Corinth, and Phocis were present. There were 700 Thespians who would go on to become some of the greatest warriors in history, and 400 Thebans whose allegiance was dubious. They were arranged in a rotational system by Leonidas. To keep the front line fresh, the Spartans would occupy the deadliest position, the front, and then cycle out to let the allies engage in combat. They formed a wall of wood and bronze over the whole width of the pass by locking their shields together. This wall was visible to the Persians who were observing from a distance. They noticed the red cloaks, which were meant to conceal blood. The Paeans' war hymns to Apollo were chanted in a rhythmic manner. The signal came from Xerxes. Medes and Siconians advanced in the first wave. They roared as they raced, intimidating the enemies with a chaotic, scary roar. The Greeks, however, remained silent. There was no fear. With their knees bowed, shields linked, and spears level, they simply stood there. With the ferocity of a car wreck, the Persians crashed into the Greek line. It was an overwhelming noise, the horrific crunch of corpses being crushed by the force of the mob behind them, the shatter of wood, and the shriek of metal on metal. However, the line remained intact. The geography held. They had closed the hot gates. In the conventional sense, the collision at the hot gates was not a battle. The slaughter was industrial. We must examine the two armies' engineering to understand why the Persians were being slaughtered so effectively. This was a battle between two entirely different military ideologies, weight and discipline versus speed and mobility. The Persians were created for Asia's wide plains.
They were swift, light, and used archers to weaken the opposition before advancing. Fish scale iron or quilted linen were sewn onto leather to make their armor. Wicker and weaved branches served as their shields, which might deflect an arrow but were ineffective against a powerful blow. Their swords were daggers and their spears were short. Instead of cracking up a metal shell, they were designed to pursue escaping adversaries. One thing was intended for the Greeks, and the Spartans in particular, the crash. They were called hoplites, after the hoplon, a huge concave wooden shield with a thin layer of bronze covering it. It was almost 20 pounds in weight. A Spartan's shield covered both his left side and the right side of the warrior standing next to him when he was in formation. The phalanx was only as powerful as the men's relationship because of this interlocking form. Spartans did not flee because if one man did, the wall would collapse. They learned about the phalanx's horrifying geometry as the chaos crashed into this wall. The dory, a spear that was 7 to 9 feet long, was used in combat by the Spartans. Persian weaponry were much shorter. It was a mathematical outcome. Before the Persians could even approach the Greeks for a blow, they were being killed. Imagine being on the Persian attack's front lines. The weight of thousands of men behind you is propelling you forward, but you are unable to get to the enemy. You see nothing except an impenetrable wall of bronze shields. With the rhythmic accuracy of a sewing machine, row after row of spear tips are piercing out of that wall. The Spartan merely shifts to the secondary weapon on the other end of the spear, the soritor, or lizard killer, a bronze spike meant to kill the injured on the ground when you seize a spear shaft to break it. The Spartans were controlling the body pile in addition to murdering. The efficiency seemed robotic and icy. The Persian corpses became a barrier as they piled up. In order to keep their footing, the Greeks would advance, practically carpeting the ground with their adversaries by shoving the dead and the dying with their shields. This was the tremendous shove, the oismos. It wasn't the dramatic one-on-one battles we see in motion pictures. It was a deadly rugby scrum. The bronze wall was propelled forward like a bulldozer by the phalanx's back rows pushing into the front rows.
Men in the front lines could be crushed to death without ever being hit by a weapon because to the extreme pressure. The lungs were forced to expel the breath. The weight of the group caused ribs to break. It was a nightmare for the Persians. The shock of the huge Greek spears broke their wicker shields. The Spartans' thick bronze breastplates were impervious to their swords. They were engaged in combat with ghosts, nameless fighters concealed by metal helmets who never ceased stabbing, screaming, or speaking. According to Herodotus, Xerxes leaped to his feet 3 times in fear while seeing from his golden throne on a neighboring hill. He didn't fear for his own life. His worldview was crumbling and he was afraid. He was the monarch of monarchs. He had an unbeatable army. Nevertheless, he was witnessing the threshing of his warriors like wheat. The first wave broke by the afternoon. Thousands of people were left dead in the small pass as the Medes and Scythians withdrew. The blood was sticky on the ground. The sulfur of the hot springs and the metallic odor of blood filled the air. The Spartans sharpened their weapons. They sipped water. They turned their lines around. They weren't even at their most vicious yet. They were aware that the initial wave was really a warm-up. They were aware that Xerxes would not be amused by this slight. They noticed the dust rising once more as they peered up the pass. The king had finished dispatching the amateurs. The Immortals were being sent by him. On that first deadly day, a weird silence descended upon the Persian lines as the sun started to set. The worst of the wreckage was removed from the battlefield, and the shattered remains of the Medes were hauled away. A strange sound came from the Persian camp. It wasn't the conscripts' frantic yelling. It was the controlled, rhythmic marching of 10,000 men moving as one cohesive unit. Playing his ace was Xerxes. He dispatched the Immortals. These weren't only soldiers. They were the empire's fearsome elite. They were named Immortals because their unit's strength was never permitted to fall below 10,000, not because they were immortal. A man would immediately step up from the reserve to take his position if he fell. It appeared to the enemy that they were battling a hydra with instantaneous head regeneration. With cloth cowls covering all except their eyes, they marched silently. They carried the best weapons the empire could make, and they wore gold jewelry beneath their robes as a symbol of their great position. The emperor's personal shadows were the men who had taken over the known world. Satisfied that this would be the end, Xerxes reclined on his throne. The Spartans were dehydrated, exhausted, and covered in blood. The Immortals would just pass over them. However, the elites encountered the same physics issue that had destroyed the conscripts as they got closer to the scorching gates. The Immortals were adept at maneuvering in open fields.
They were taught how to move quickly and nimbly to avoid an adversary. However, there was no space for dancing within the pass. The Spartans recognized these individuals as dangerous when they saw them approaching. The Immortals carried shorter spears and wicker shields, but they were heavier than the Medes and better protected by iron scales under their vibrant tunics. There was still a technological divide. A grinding standoff resulted from the collision of the two elite armies. With suicidal courage, the Immortals hurled themselves at the bronze wall. In an attempt to break the wood, they grasped the Spartan spears with their bare hands. To hinder the Greeks, they attempted to crawl beneath the shields. However, the phalanx was a device made to repel alien things. With their huge shields crashing into the Persian elites' faces, the Spartans advanced, pushed, and stabbed. The Spartans then took an apparently disastrous action. They shattered. The Greek line broke abruptly. The Spartans turned away and started running toward the back of the pass in a terrified, chaotic crowd. The Immortals roared with victory as they had defeated their unbeatable foe. They abandoned their ranks in the excitement of the hunt, breaking their own orderly formation and charging forward to kill the escaping Greeks. It was a trap. Steely nerves and complete faith in your commander were necessary for this maneuver. The riskiest thing a soldier can do is flee with their backs to the world. However, the retreating Spartans planted their feet, turned 180 degrees simultaneously, and lowered their spears at a silent signal. Now sprinting at full speed in a confused crowd, the Immortals raced directly into a new wall of spear points. The massacre was disastrous. The Persian charge's momentum was used against them. The dozens impaled them because they were unbalanced, out of formation, and unable to stop. With mechanical efficiency, the Spartans slaughtered them. This occurred more than once. The Spartans used their own anger against the Immortals while they played with them. It was a psychological warfare masterclass. They demonstrated that discipline rather than numbers wins wars. The Immortals were withdrawing by nightfall. The Persian troops suffered greatly psychologically. These were the untouchables, the gods of war, and a bunch of weary old men had defeated them. The Persian camp was in a furious mood that evening. Xerxes had stopped leaping from his throne. His indecision paralyzed him. He had unsuccessfully flung his sheer heft upon the Greeks. The Greeks were unsuccessful when he threw his finest elites upon them. His alternatives were dwindling. As the Spartans cleaned their wounds and consumed their few provisions in celebration of their unattainable win, a tragedy was taking place in the shadows above them. The war of tactics had been won by the Greeks, but the battle of information was about to be lost. Ephialtes, a native, was traveling to the Persian camp. He was not a fighter. He was not a general. He was a shepherd with a secret worth over 100,000 soldiers. He was aware how to get around the wall. The tiniest of hinges frequently determine the course of history. A few thousand soldiers and a deft use of geography had held back the full power of the Persian Empire for 2 days. Xerxes felt ashamed. His officers were afraid of his fury. Before it had really started, the invasion of Europe was halting. However, a man who would alter the course of the Western world appeared in the shadows of the Persian camp. Ephialtes was his name. Ephialtes is frequently portrayed in popular culture as a hunchback shunned by Spartan society and a disfigured monster. This invention is dramatic. In other ways, the historical reality is far more unremarkable and unsettling. Ephialtes was a Greek shepherd from the area. He was not a monster. He was merely a money-hungry individual. He spotted a commercial opportunity when he observed the great king's desperation and the carnage at the hot gates. He went up to the generals of Xerxes and explained what they had been hoping for. Above Thermopylae, high in the mountains, was a back door. The Anapaia trail was an old goat track. It descended behind the Spartan wall after winding through Mount Kallidromos forests. It was manageable, despite being challenging, steep, and obscured by dense oak trees. Ephialtes volunteered to lead the Persians through the night in exchange for a bag of money. Xerxes acted without hesitation. He sent the Immortals, the same men who had been humiliated hours earlier, up the mountain while it was still dark. Just imagine the stress of that ascent. Under the leadership of a traitor, thousands of Persian warriors moved in complete darkness. Dry oak leaves littered the path. Herodotus gives us a terrifying auditory detail. The sound of thousands of feet crunching on dry leaves seemed like a roaring wind blowing through the woods since the air was so calm. Leonidas had put 1,000 Phocian hoplites up on the mountain to guard this precise path. The flank is what he had expected. The cork in the bottle was supposed to be these men. The Spartans below were secure if they held the path. However, the Phocians made a disastrous error when they heard the crunching of leaves and saw the Immortals' torches coming from the forest. When the Phocian commander saw the enormous Persian column, he thought the Immortals were about to assault. The Phocians fled the narrow path to the top of a nearby hill in a panic, fighting for their country. They prepared to die. However, they were unimportant to the Persians. Hydanes, the Persian commander, saw the way become clear. He merely marched his troops past the Phocians after ordering his archers to fire a few volleys to keep them pinned down. He didn't pay any attention to the Phocians at all. It was an enormous tactical error. The Phocians had unintentionally given Greece access by withdrawing to a stronger defensive position. With their weapons at the ready, they waited on their hill and watched in fear as the Immortals swept past them, disappearing down the trail toward the sea and the back of the Spartan line. In the early morning light, the camp runners hurried to Leonidas's tent below. The news was not good. After examining the sacrifice's entrails, the seers prophesied death. Breathless, lookouts rushed in. "We have the Persians behind us." The pincers had closed. They had just had their greatest weapon, geography, turned against them. The hot gates had become a tomb instead of a shield. Day 3, dawn. The news was much chillier than the chilly air. Breathless and pallid, scouts staggered into the Greek camp. The Immortals were making their way down the mountain. The trap had closed abruptly. A final council of war was called by Leonidas. He studied the faces of his comrades, men from Mycenae, Arcadia, and Corinth. They had fought valiantly, but staying now meant certain death. Leonidas showed he was a strategist as well as a fighter. He didn't insist that they perish beside him. He commanded them to go. He knew Greece would need every blade in the upcoming conflicts. There was no reason to waste 7,000 lives.
He ordered them to reorganize, retire south, and defend their cities. Leonidas, however, was unable to depart. Spartan law was clear. There was no way to retreat. A king of Sparta did not flee. In addition, months prior, the Oracle of Delphi had provided a prophecy. Either the Lacedaemonians will lament a king's passing, or the Persians will pillage your magnificent city. Leonidas made the decision to be the sacrifice that kept his city intact. But history books and films tend to end there. 300 Spartans reportedly stood by themselves. This is the legend's biggest injustice. Leonidas realized he wasn't alone when the dust from his retreating comrades settled. The order to retire was disregarded by 700 soldiers from the city of Thespiae under the command of their general, Demophilus. We have to take a moment to honor the Thespians. The Spartans were made to fight. They were carrying out a lifetime of brainwashing. The Thespians weren't. They were farmers, artisans, and residents. There was no law compelling them to remain. They lacked a prophecy. The Spartan peninsula did not protect their city. It was right in the Persian army's route. They were effectively ensuring that their hometown would burn to the ground by remaining. But they persisted. For the simple reason that they felt it was the proper thing to do, they decided to stand and die with the Spartans. There were also 400 Thebans, though historians disagree on whether they remained as prisoners to guarantee their allegiance or as volunteers. The Helots, the Spartan servants and light infantry, who most likely stood and perished in the hundreds without being documented by history, must also be remembered. It wasn't 300 versus the world then. About 1,500 guys were up against a tsunami. The understanding descended upon the camp as the sun rose. Today there would be no sleep, no rest, and no rotations. Leonidas assembled his troops. He gave them no hope. A miracle was not what he promised. He provided them with clarification. Legend has it that he turned to his allies and uttered one of the most fierce statements in military history. He did not instruct them to offer prayers. He instructed them to eat. "Eat a good breakfast, men, for tonight we dine in Hades." It was a somber jest, a somber acknowledgement of their situation. They were no longer struggling to survive. They were engaged in combat over the number of dead. The objective had changed from guarding the route to causing the enemy's psyche as much trauma as possible. They intended to make the Persians pay so much for these final yards of dirt that they would never be able to forget Sparta's name. They tightened the shields. They exchanged the final drops of water. For the final time, the 400 Thebans, the 700 Thespians, and the 300 Spartans faced the Persian Ocean. The sun dawned on a different kind of army on the third day. The Thespians and Spartans were aware of their surroundings. It was the end of the tactical game. Holding the line and conserving energy were no longer necessary. Taking as many Persians with them as possible before the end was the sole remaining goal. The men were told by Leonidas to abandon the security of the slender Phocian wall. In a suicidal move that permitted them to take on more opponents at once, they marched out into the larger portion of the pass.
They didn't hold off until the Persians launched an assault. They made a charge. This was no longer a deadlock. There was a fight. With the rage of men who had already come to terms with their own demise, the Greeks smashed into the Persian lines. They trampled the Persians into the mud and drove them back, tossing them into the sea. According to Herodotus, in order to push their troops forward against the Greek devils, the Persian commanders had to stand behind them and lash them with whips.
The inevitable occurred during this initial frenzied charge. Sparta's king, Leonidas, was defeated. Hollywood heroes typically pass away last, by themselves, following a dramatic monologue. History is harsh. Leonidas was probably pierced by Persian spears or arrows early in the final fight, but his death set off the battle's most violent climax. A king's body was revered in ancient Greek battle. It was worse than defeat to lose it to the enemy. Over his corpse, a fierce struggle broke out. The site looked like it belonged in the Iliad. The Spartans charged ahead after witnessing their king's demise. They didn't engage in ground combat, they battled over his body. The Persians attempted to pull him away 4 times. The Greeks drove them back 4 times, slicing through heaps of enemy corpses to free their fallen commander. They prevailed in spite of all the difficulties. In a last show of allegiance to the man who had brought them to hell, they dragged Leonidas back to their lines. However, the weapons were not working. The dory, the weighty spears, had long since broken. The warriors pulled out their xiphos, which are short, leaf-shaped iron swords used in close quarters. They hacked till the blades broke or became dulled. The most terrifying part of the fight then started. Historians are still troubled by a phrase written by Herodotus. The Spartans and Thespians fought with their hands and teeth after their swords were lost and their spears were broken. Like untamed animals, they were tearing at the intruders. It was bare, primordial violence. They were biting into the throats of armored guys, hitting them and strangling them with their bare hands. The Persians were frightened by this exhibition of fury. The Persians halted charging despite their overwhelming numbers. They were too terrified to approach these bloodied, unarmed lunatics. The surviving Greeks were gradually driven back by the sheer force of numbers. They made one final retreat past the Rall to a little hillock that is now known as Colonus Hill. A narrow, compact circle was formed by them. The trap was sealed when the Immortals came from behind. The Greeks were encircled. Xerxes had had enough. In direct confrontation with these beasts, he didn't want to lose any more troops. He gave the command for his army to retreat. Thousands of archers moved ahead. With their bows up, they obscured the light. The conclusion was hardly dramatic. There was a whisper, the rain-like sound of thousands of arrows falling. The final Thespians and Spartans did not perish in battle. Buried beneath an iron storm, they perished close together. A thick quiet descended upon the pass as the final bowstrings broke and the dust settled. The cost of admittance had been exorbitant, but the hot gates were now open. The remains of the final defenders atop the little mound of Colonus Hill resembled an odd bristling forest because they were so heavily coated in arrows. This description is not merely poetic. When archaeologists dug up that very hill in 1939, they discovered thousands of Persian bronze arrowheads hidden in the ground. They are still on display in museums today. Physical evidence of the storm that put an end to the Spartan resistance is provided by twisted and corroded metal fragments.
Xerxes strolled across the battlefield. His stomach must have churned at what he saw. Even though he had prevailed, he had lost an estimated 20,000 troops to a much smaller force. 2 of his own brothers and numerous high-ranking nobles of the empire were among the dead. According to Herodotus, Xerxes ordered a big cover-up because he was so afraid of his own troops after realizing the extent of the catastrophe. In an attempt to deceive the rest of the fleet into believing the victory had been simple, he had trenches constructed and swiftly buried the majority of his own dead, leaving only approximately 1,000 visible.
It was the first time in history that military propaganda spin had been documented. But only one man could truly make him feel dread and wrath. The Persian troops informed the king that they had finally located Leonidas's body among the mass of dead. Bravery was highly valued in Persian culture. An honorable enemy monarch would typically be treated with respect. He would be buried with rites or have his body returned. In the past, Xerxes had treated other captive adversaries with respect, but not this time. Something in Xerxes had been shattered by the 3 days of humiliation, the death of his brothers, and the destruction of his invincibility. He gave the order for Leonidas's head to be severed and his body to be crucified and publicly impaled on a stake. This was a startling transgression of both international norm and religious law. It was forbidden. Xerxes was displaying weakness rather than strength by disfiguring the body. It was an outburst. Because he was unable to overcome the man's spirit, he was attempting to kill the legend. A horrifying reality started to permeate the ranks as the Persian army got ready to march south toward Athens, leaving the Spartan king's severed body to decay. Before the fight, Xerxes had received a warning from the banished Spartan Demaratus. Now Xerxes asked him a question that betrayed his nervousness. How many more of them are there? There are many great cities in Greece, but there is one called Sparta, and in that city there are 8,000 more men just like these, Demaratus said, glancing at the devastation and the dead Immortals. Xerxes' face must have lost its color. He has killed 300 people over the course of days and 20,000 lives. The math was scary. He wouldn't have an army left to conquer anything if he had to battle 8,000 of them. The Greeks were tactically defeated at the Battle of Thermopylae. There was an open road to Athens. The city would catch fire. However, the Persians had already lost both psychologically and strategically. They were moving as men who understood they could bleed, not as conquerors. A stone pillar was built at the fighting site a few months after the carnage. The poet Simonides wrote an inscription on it. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie," is a simple yet eerie couplet that soldiers have recited for 2,500 years. Thermopylae was, by definition, a defeat. They lost the pass. After being taken prisoner, Athens was destroyed by fire. Leonidas would be reduced to a footnote if the story ended there, a foolish monarch who wasted his life. However, the tale didn't stop there. The 3 days that the 300 purchased were the most costly period in recorded history.
They bought the Greek fleet enough time to regroup and the Athenians enough time to flee their city. The Greeks broke the back of the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis a few weeks later, and Demaratus's prophecy was fulfilled at the Battle of Plataea a year later. At last, the Spartans organized. They deployed thousands of men, not just 300. The Persian army was destroyed by the complete power of the Spartan war machine under the command of Pausanias, Leonidas's nephew. It was the end of the invasion. Not only did the sacrifice at the scorching gates save a nation, it also preserved an ideology. It maintained the precarious experiment of Greek philosophy, art, and democracy, the basis of Western civilization as we know it today. The world we live in now may be drastically different if the Spartans had fled and chosen the simple route. We remember them because they demonstrated the ultimate meaning of freedom, not because they prevailed. Freedom is more than just being free. It's the capacity to refuse in the face of overwhelming odds and imminent death. When Leonidas yelled, "Molon, Labe," he was referring to more than simply his weapons. He was discussing his dignity. He was arguing that some things are worth more than life itself. They now have a contemporary statue of Leonidas. Those two phrases are still engraved in stone beneath his metal feet, a promise to the free and a warning to tyrants. Come and take them. You are obviously someone who appreciates the harsh, difficult, and often uncomfortable realities of our past if you have followed me all the way through this journey.
Please make sure you are subscribed and have the bell notification enabled if this story touched you. I still have a great deal of lost history to share with you. I also have a question for you to respond to in the comments before you leave. Do you believe that the Spartan philosophy is still relevant in today's society, where safety is frequently given top priority, or is it a risky holdover from a violent past? I'll read what you think below. I appreciate your watching, and I hope to see you in the upcoming chapter.